The following program is brought to you by the University of Kentucky, Baylor University, and Cuyahoga Community College. Partial corporate support was provided by the Marantz Corporation.
Live from Cleveland, Ohio, welcome to the Oral History Association's first national video conference, Communities, Diversity, and Oral History. Today is the opening of the 26th annual meeting of the Oral History Association at the Stouffer Tower City Plaza Hotel, adjacent to Cleveland's historic Terminal Tower in the heart of downtown Cleveland. Nearly 300 oral historians from around the world are gathering for a 4-day conference of exciting and stimulating oral history discourse. Today's program is originating from the Metro campus of Cuyahoga Community College, host institution for the Oral History Association's 26th annual meeting.
Hello from Cleveland, Ohio. My name is Terry Birdwhistell. I'm this year's president of the Oral History Association and from the University of Kentucky. I'm so pleased that you could join us today for this first ever OHA National Video Conference. As the opening said, we're coming to you from Cuyahoga Community College, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all our friends at Cuyahoga Community College for making this possible. Dr. Jerry Sue Owen, president of Cuyahoga Community College, Vice President Paul Shoemaker, and Assistant Vice President Doug Fox. I also want to mention the other sponsors for this video conference, again, University of Kentucky, Baylor University, and our good friends at the Marantz Corporation who made this video conference possible. We're undertaking this video conference experiment this year because OHA has felt all along in its existence that we need to reach out to people and share what we have to say about oral history, and now we want to have you share your oral history knowledge with us today through this interactive video. We hope that we'll be able, in the next 2.5 hours, to discuss some very important topics and some methods related to doing oral history and have a wonderful discourse that we can all benefit from. To make this possible, all during the show, there's going to be an 800 number that will be appearing on your screen. It's very important for you to take advantage of this 800 number and call us when you have questions or comments. You can call and ask individual panelists specific questions. You can call and ask general questions that can be fielded by the panelists. Or you can call and tell us something that's been going on in your state or region or community about how you're doing oral history and have us react to that. It really, to be successful, we need to have this sharing of information. We also have with us today a studio audience that has come over from the on-site conference that just got underway even as we speak over at the Stouffer Tower City Plaza Hotel. We have about 25 oral historians from around the country who will be participating in this video conference, and hopefully you all in the audience will be asking us questions as we go along too, and we hope to hear from you. At this time, I want to introduce my very good friend and colleague from the University of Texas at Austin, Dr. George C. Wright. Dr. Wright is Vice Provost and the Maston Gentry White Professor of Southern History at the University of Texas. He has served as a Director of the African and Afro-American Studies Center. He is the author of several books on dealing with race relations in this country. His most recent book is called Racial Violence, which is a study of race relations in Kentucky. He has also done a book on the history of blacks in Louisville, which very much is a community study. And during the course of the day, he's going to be appearing on several panels talking about his work. But today, to get the program started off, George, I wanted to ask you, the topic today is diversity in communities in oral history. And we're going to be looking at it from very different angles today. Why is that so important to us today to be addressing this issue?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here. What makes this such an exciting and timely topic is that, as we all know, in the large American public, especially in the media, in the intellectual community and life, for a number of years now, this whole concept of diversity has been discussed from a number of perspectives. Many people applaud the diversity in American society. They've talked about the strengths that our nation has as a result of that. Then other people will look at some of the events in our society, be it the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or the celebration of Columbus, and they will talk about the fact that what makes this country unique is that though there were people who came here from everywhere, we became Americans. So it's a perspective, it's an issue that you can bring many different perspectives to. And then what's so important about the oral history aspect of bringing this into play is that so often we've heard people make comments, but these have been our people who write for newspapers, television commentators, or university professors, and so often we've not talked enough to people in communities in various parts of this country to see what they think about when it comes to diversity. What does diversity mean to them in that regard? And so I think from those perspectives, this makes this a very timely and exciting topic for us to be looking at today.
I know in your work in Kentucky, a lot of people don't think of Kentucky as being a very diverse state, and when you started doing work on black history in Kentucky, there weren't a lot of sources to go to, and actually oral history allowed you to let people understand better that there was diversity, and there is diversity in a state even like Kentucky.
Oh, exactly. One of the things I will always remember is that when you look at the first go-round at the census, let's say of Kentucky, or even more specifically of Louisville, you will see that they will say predominantly white and black, but within that there are people who came to Louisville from Germany, so there were a lot of German Americans there. There were Irish Americans in Louisville, and under the category of black, there were some people who were born as free blacks, many of people who were former slaves in Louisville, and also Louisville would have both in and out migration, and so consequently you would have people moving from rural Kentucky to Louisville, and at the same time you would have people moving from the deep south to Louisville who would only be there for a while on their way to, let's say, Gary, Indiana, or Indianapolis, or Detroit, or Chicago. And so consequently, even under the categories of just white and black, which are far too simplistic in looking at a place like Louisville or Kentucky, there are variations within there. So consequently, oral history was one of the techniques that gave me and others an opportunity to see the richness within the black community. And in fact, one of the things it's also made me do is that so often when we talk about black people, and especially in the days of segregation, we've assumed all black people were a monolithic group. And you clearly come away with a sense that there's always been a diversity among black people, just like there has been among white people as well.
Now, you started to touch upon this earlier. When you look at American history, diversity was once looked at as something bad for this country, and now it's something that's celebrated. Where are we on that?
Okay. I think it depends on exactly what group or who you're talking to. On the one hand, I've been fortunate enough over the last few years to see some other cultures, and one of the strengths, I would argue, of the United States versus some of the European countries is the fact that we do have a diverse group of people, that the fact that you were born in Finland or Germany or Africa is not held against you. And so consequently, within our society, we can see people in all areas who come from many different backgrounds. But yet, on the other hand, and one of the things I will be very aware of today is that even though I will say it's important to understand that a German American might bring this to the table, a black American might bring that to the table, at some point, many people cross a line. And they tend to see diversity as, in many ways, as dividing us. And I often wonder, where does divisiveness come into play? An example would be, as a historian, I've given numerous presentations for Afro-American History Month. And I try to do this within the context that black history, though it informs us about this one particular group, it's informative for all people, and it's something that all of us should know more about. But yet, if you go too far, you could make Afro-American history be something just for black people. And I think that then has a divisiveness to it. So on the one hand, it's important for us to applaud our differences, but on the other hand, it's important for us to show the commonality among the black experience and the overall experience of all Americans.
Right. We're going to be talking about many different kinds of communities and how diversity impacts those communities and how oral history can help us understand that diversity in the communities. One of the communities you operate in is a college campus in Texas, and I know that that is a very diverse campus, and there's some issues there that you deal with as an administrator. How does being a historian who has dealt with these issues on a historical level help you in your work as an administrator at, say, UT?
One of the things that has served me very well is to come into something with the concept that we have to be appreciative and respectful of everyone's background, of what they bring to the table. And so consequently at a university, and though ours may be more diverse than some, I think this would be typical of any of the universities, that you might have people whose ancestors have been in America for hundreds of years. You might have some people whose ancestors have only been here for a decade or more. And all of these students come to our university with certain expectations. One of the things as an administrator I think I've come to understand is that any issue, something like multicultural education, is fraught with many different perspectives on it. For instance, at our campus, we have to be very careful in saying that we're going to make it become mandatory that you have to take Afro-American history. Though I teach black history, it's important equally, I would argue, for students to be aware of women's history or the study of religious ethnic groups and so on down the line. And so I think we have to be aware of the fact that when we say minority these days, it can encompass a lot of different groups. And I think on our campus is one of them. For instance, I have not even mentioned Mexican Americans, which, as we know in American society, under the rubric of Hispanic or Mexican American, is the fastest growing minority group of all and will at some point, some people may even argue today, outnumber black Americans as the single largest minority group. And so for someone who came from Kentucky, moving to a place like Texas where there is clearly a sizable minority group in addition to blacks, kind of complicates but makes it even more exciting to see how the groups interact with each other and then how they interact with the larger white group as well. But you're correct, on a college campus these days, there are a lot of different groups who come under the label of minority. So diversity is most definitely an issue that we're working on. And as if anyone had the opportunity to talk to me at great length would find out, we have not found the solution to the best way to approach diversity on our campus.
Now, during today's program, we're going to be looking at issues in terms of collecting oral histories on the community level, and I know that's been very helpful to you in your research in the archives in Kentucky and around the South. We're also going to be talking about some archival matters involved in that. But a big issue in two of our panels will be how oral history works in a community in crisis, how oral history works in dealing with diversity in these larger communities. And I think a lot of oral historians who are working at the community level want to think of oral history as a very positive influence on those communities. Do you see that as a very positive influence?
And one of the main ways I would argue that oral history is a positive is what I discovered in my work that touched upon violence, that touched upon police brutality, that touched upon our legal system, that I heard many accounts from black people in Kentucky, specifically in my hometown of Lexington, whereby the police had been insensitive to them. And I hope, and one of the reasons I am a historian, that even though I think it's enlightening for me to talk about the past, my work is important when it shows public policy implications. And I want to believe, and since I've been contacted by groups like the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, that they read my work, they read the work of other scholars, and it has given them better insights into why some groups have felt alienated, let's say, from the establishment. So clearly, oral history remains a voice for many people who have not been heard of in some other outlets. So clearly, oral history does, even when we're looking just at the past, can have implications for where we are today.
I should mention that George is going to be our featured speaker at our conference here in Cleveland tonight, and one of the things that George is going to be sharing with the on-site conference here is almost a sort of an autobiographical look at your life, because your topic tonight is called From Project to Project in Search of Our Multicultural Past, and I guess this is something that we find as oral historians that is very personal to us when we get involved in these issues.
Right. What I will say here is that from interviewing a wide range of black and white people, I have come to understand why black people can see progress in some things where other black people for years would say, well, nothing has changed over time. And I have learned an awful lot about life myself through them, that they have shown me where the struggle used to be, where steps were made in a positive sense, and how anything that I have accomplished is directly related to what black people did years ago. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think any one of us who is under 50 years of age should say is that if we've accomplished anything in life, it's because there were black people as well as white people who were very sincere out there struggling for certain changes to come about. And some of us who came to maturity in the 1960s and 1970s benefited from the struggle of other people. The tragedy is sometimes some people who are unaware of oral history, unaware of the past of their own communities, would assume they've accomplished something on their own without realizing that black people were demanding these changes for decades. And that ironically, when the changes came about, these people could not then walk through the door and it was left for other people. But I think I've learned an awful lot from oral history, if nothing else, to be optimistic that changes can occur for people in our society. Changes doesn't always occur when we would want them to, but those people who are demanding, those people who are persistent can make changes. And I've interviewed a lot of people who I think said that to me in one way or the other.
All right. Thanks, George. George is going to be appearing on two other panels throughout the program and discussing more of his work and commenting on oral history. Right now, we want to, as we're getting set up for our next panel, we want to look at a segment of a videotape documentary that was produced here in Cleveland by Michael Bacon. It's called What is Fair? It's a history of the Cleveland Urban League that was produced for the 50th anniversary of the Cleveland Urban League. So let's take a look at that, and we'll be back with our next panel in just a minute.
We have been on the road for a long time. We have moved in name from Negro and colored to black and African American. We have moved in spirit from differential to confident, subordinate to secure. The distance we've traveled should make us proud, but the road ahead is still long. For the last 75 years, most of this century, the Urban League of Greater Cleveland has traveled with us. And on that journey, they, like us, have only wanted what is fair, what is just, what is ours.
Let's do it. So that we are treated as equals, that we're not in fact trying to ask for the scraps off the table, but we in fact own the table in the house.
What the world needs now is love. More love is what we need.
The time has come that Americans should understand what democracy is all about, what the American promise is all about.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor.
I fought 5 years in service for freedom. I don't know why we can't have some over here in Cleveland.
At the advent of World War I, America is in a curious position. We lack the manpower to capitalize on our industrial might. The supply of cheap labor provided by European immigrants virtually dries up as hostilities begin. Company agents head south to recruit from a heretofore untapped labor source, the Negro. They promise fair pay, improved living conditions, and escape from the Jim Crow reality that is life in the South. Rural blacks come north in droves, seeking a better life for themselves and their children. What they do encounter is unlike anything they have ever known.
A very strange environment for many of them because they had come from rural areas in the South and not accustomed to urban living, not accustomed to the environment, nor dealing with racial circumstances in which they were now living, working in industry and dealing with whites in a different way.
We were overcrowded. They didn't have the housing. We didn't have really the stores, the few grocery stores that we had. They didn't have the food that the Negroes were accustomed of having. They didn't have any of that.
This is the state of affairs in Cleveland on December 17th of 1917. It is the day that the Negro Welfare Association, the forerunner of the Urban League of Greater Cleveland, is founded.
Living conditions for those people during the time when the Urban League came into existence was extremely difficult. People are living, doubling up and tripling up in small apartments, crowded into a relatively small section of the city, sometimes living in shacks, living in railroad cars.
Those lucky enough to find housing at all are more often than not relegated to living in an area around 55th and Central known as the Roaring Third. It is an area notorious for policemen whose main exercise is turning their backs.
The prostitutes were all in one area that was called the Roaring Third. They were not spread out. And the Roaring Third, those houses were big looking, and the women and the men had big cars, that came down, and you could think what you please.
From the outset, the NWA is an interracial organization. Theirs is a policy of inclusion. They provide assistance in housing, employment, health, and education, and help the expanding Negro community deal with their new surroundings. Their work is cut out for them. They choose Dr. William Connors as their first executive director.
I want to take this opportunity to announce an arrangement that the Oral History Association has with Marantz Corporation at this time. Marantz Corporation, as I told you earlier, is helping to underwrite this video conference. In addition to that, Meddy Allister, General Manager of the Marantz Corporation, has put together a purchasing program that is an agreement between the Oral History Association and Marantz to help market the Marantz products. Part of the purchasing program involves if you are able to or need equipment and are able to purchase it directly from the Marantz Corporation, you will receive a discount on your price. And in addition, Marantz is offering to make a donation to the permanent OHA endowment. We're not going to be going into a lot of details of the purchasing program today, but I would encourage you to look into it because the information on it will be appearing later in future OHA publications, in our newsletter and in our review. And so I want to take again this opportunity to thank Meddy Allister and his colleagues at Marantz for helping us out today. In this panel, we're going to be talking about collecting your community's oral histories, and we have gathered here some outstanding oral historians from around the country. On my immediate left is Rina Benmayor, who is the Research Director of Cultural Studies at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. And she has done extensive oral history work on the Puerto Rican community in New York. On my immediate right is Rose Diaz, who's Associate Director for the Center of Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico. She's directed many community-level oral history projects and is interested in multicultural issues in her research on the West. At my far left is Ed Miggins, and Ed is Professor of History and Urban Studies and Director of the Greater Cleveland Oral History and Community Studies Center right here at Cuyahoga Community College. And Ed has directed many projects right here in Cleveland that look into the issues of immigration and ethnicity here in Cleveland. And a little bit later we're going to be looking at a videotaped documentary that he put together. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to start with you, Ed, since we're at your institution, the host institution for this conference, and find out briefly how a person like yourself got involved in oral history work here in Cleveland and at this community college.
Well, a lot of the work that I'm doing is directly related to my family. We were immigrants from Ireland, and I grew up in New York City, and my father kept these rich social, cultural, and moral traditions alive in our family by telling us stories about the old country as well as his experiences as an immigrant in America, and that was really the foundation for much of my work, and that is there are cultures that carry on oral history traditions as a given. And I came to Cleveland, and the thing I noticed about many of my students is that they came from this rich variety of neighborhoods in this city where there's over 60 different nationality groups. And I felt like oral history was a way for me to connect them to American history, as well as to assign projects to them that they could contribute histories of their families, their neighborhoods, their grandparents, and that really made my American history classes come alive at Cuyahoga Community College.
Well, there was no shortage of ethnic variety here in Cleveland as you set out to do this project, was it?
But once again, if you look at the books that have been written about Cleveland, there's again a tremendous omission on working class immigrant minority history that often in Cleveland we celebrate the Western Reserve area, which was settlers from New England that came here when they purchased the property from the state of Connecticut. But the celebration of minority, immigrant, working class, women's history really has only come about in the last 10 or 15 years in this city, and a big part of that was the tools that historians like myself use to capture this history, that without oral history there were really no sources for much of this information on the city. And what we've done at Cuyahoga Community College is create a center that not only keeps the projects of my students, but we also create community projects on different neighborhoods. We had a project with the Cleveland Public Library where we studied 3 inner city neighborhoods. Again, there were no sources of information on those neighborhoods except the census as well as the photos and the oral histories that we collected. So we have sort of an ongoing tradition of connecting ourselves with the local communities as well as working with our local students.
I want to remind our studio audience that we'd love to have questions from you as we go through this discussion, and I'll remind our sites around the country that the 800 number will appear on the screen, and we'd love to have you call in whenever you have a question or a comment. We really want to hear from you. Ed, how long have you been doing this oral history work here in Cleveland? What year did you start?
I was trained under an NEH fellowship in 1979, 1980 at Columbia University. There were a group of us from community colleges, and after I came back, I really started very seriously collecting oral histories in 1980. And that's when we got involved in the Heritage Program at the Cleveland Public Library. But our center at Tri-C has been organized under an academic challenge grant that was given to Cuyahoga Community College from the State Board of Regents to fund our center.
Good, good. Rina, was it hard to get your program underway when you started it? Or did you start it?
Well, actually, I work at a center that was started in the early 70s for the purpose, within the university. It's called the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and it's part of the City University of New York, and its creation was very much out of a joint effort between academics and community people.
So it was linked from the beginning?
Absolutely, from the beginning,
That's
so
good.
that the idea of doing oral history came as an effort to complement other kinds of historical research that had taken place, but also because, as all Puerto Ricans know, oral sources are sometimes the only sources for documenting the early history of the community. As a matter of fact, we never had anybody that we've approached to do oral history work with turn us down, because everybody, even from people who have never had an education to academicians, understand the need to do this kind of work because of the fact that the Puerto Rican reality is never or rarely reflected back in and it's especially important for students. We've had tremendous response from students both in the high school and college levels to seeing the kind of history that we've gathered through oral sources. Their response to it is often, oh, that's what my mother was doing all these years. So there's a very personal connection, and I should say also that there's a very personal connection between those of us doing the research and the community. We work in teams, and all the members of our team, our cultural team, are Puerto Ricans from either New York or the island, and for them, doing this history is very much part of their personal experience. So
it's been very positive.
Very, very much so, yes.
We have a question from our studio audience. Go ahead.
First, let me say aloha to my friends out in Hawaii. I'm Michael and Joe from the University of Hawaii, and we do have a remote site way out in the middle of the Pacific there, so I wanted to give my greetings to them and to show my appreciation for all the arrangements that have been made here for us in Cleveland. Everything is just working beautifully. I do have a question from my own experiences and my own research interests on Americans of Asian ancestry, and I wonder what kinds of projects might be going on in Cleveland with regard to the Asian Americans.
Well, at present, there is one project where there is a third-generation Japanese lady who's studying the Japanese that left the internment camps during World War II and came to Cleveland. But our center is producing a series of documentaries on different ethnic groups. Last year we did immigrants that went through Ellis Island. This year we're doing a study of African American migration from the South to Cleveland. We're doing one on Latinos, and then we plan to do one on Asians. And again, the Asian community is an unknown history to the larger society, that often history books only cover the older groups that have settled the city. And I feel like one of our obligations as an Oral History and Community Studies Center is to repair the kind of history that's available to our children and students in the public schools in Cleveland. So this has to be part of our ongoing effort to really discover the history and contributions of the newer groups of the city that, quite frankly, are often left out of the textbooks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. I want to encourage people to ask questions here in the studio, and I want to encourage people to call in on our 800 number, ask questions to the panel, and tell us a little bit about what's going on in your area in regard to community oral history. Rose, I want to turn to you now, and we've heard how the program in Cleveland got started, how a project in New York and with Hunter College got started. Like you, I work at a large research university, and oftentimes you don't think of large research universities dealing with community history and getting out into the community to get that type of history. How have you managed to do that at the University of New Mexico?
Well, at the University of New Mexico, we've been trying very diligently through the library system to encourage people to promote not only cultural diversity on campus, but cultural diversity and recognizing the cultural diversity that exists within the community. Mm-hmm. We found that among, for example, 550 manuscript collections that exist in special collections, very few of those represent the people who built the community. They represent the attorneys, the writers, the people who New Mexico has become famous for as a tourist attraction, rather than the community that has been there and has considerable interest and has a vested interest in promoting itself as community builders. My primary interest has been in women, and my work has been in women's history. And that comes again from, as you say, our family and what families bring to us in terms of cultural interests and cultural traditions. And so that was my interest was primarily in women, but in getting more involved as a historian, working in a academic research library, certainly led me to look at what doesn't exist in terms of primary source documentation. And we have more and more students who are insisting that we represent their community, whether it's Asian American or Hispanic. And I think that one of the things that has happened in New Mexico is that the tourism industry, once we lost the base support of extractive industry, turned to tourism, and tourism was a tricultural effort based primarily on Native American, Hispanic, and Anglo representation, which is totally false, because we have many, many more groups that have at least histories in New Mexico that go back 150, 175 years, and yet those communities were not represented. So in terms of archives and repositories, my interest is in building those primary documents for students to use.
I'm sure a question that is in the minds of our studio audience and those people watching around the country is always, okay, oral history is really great, let's go do it. How do you get it started? Where do you go for funding? What do you do when you want to start these kind of programs? We all know we want to do it. Yeah, we know we want to do it. How do we do it? How did you do it?
Funding, the vision existed when we were building a new center, which is a primary, will be a premier center for documentary research and studies at the University of New Mexico through the library. And one of the efforts that we're working toward, and one of the visions that we had, was to create an oral history program that went along the lines of which we were creating our manuscript collections. So what we did was to affiliate with several other university programs, the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute, the American Studies Department, the Center for Regional Studies. And through those affiliations then came the idea of collaboration efforts with regard to oral history. The other programs that we have, and again, we're looking at institutions and state and federal level fundings, which are increasingly decreasing at rapid rates. So while we in the library have to look at taking what would take us a 10% increase per year just to maintain our actual funding is really increased by 2 to 3% every year. So there is no way that the library can support that program itself. So we looked at 4 affiliated programs. We looked at other contractual arrangements with the National Park Service. We are currently working with the National Park Service Spanish Colonial Research Project, which again is mostly documentary studies, physically locating materials regarding this year the Columbus expeditions, and their agenda is again analysis and interpretation for federal sites. One of the most important things that we see coming up are contractual obligations with the Chaco Canyon Archive, for example. Now they are interested in contracting with the center in terms of interviewing the early archaeologists, the Native American peoples of the area, and again we're looking at funding sources through those kinds of things. But the vision has been to create a viable oral history program. We have since, over the last 2 years, brought a very good oral historian, Carlos Vasquez, who came recently from the UCLA program, who's brought tremendous expertise in terms of method, theory, application, and added that to the community networks that were established from these other affiliated programs. So we're actually looking at many joint associations and putting those together. We also feel that legislatively and federally we can put together more significant grants and proposals through those.
Good. Sounds great. We have a call now from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, so why don't we go ahead with that? Hello, Harrisburg. Go ahead. Hello? Are you there? Okay, we'll go back to that in a moment. Rina, in terms of getting your program off to start, you talked about bringing the community together with the people working in the center. How about the funding of your operation?
Funding's always been a very difficult project for us. Our center does have a permanent research staff, so that in some ways we can get projects off the ground even if we don't get some outside funding. But in the past few years, we, as funding has dried up for research projects in the humanities and oral history and that sort of thing, we've turned to a different kind of practice, which has been not simply just mounting an oral history project and going out in the community and interviewing people coming back and processing and archiving and publishing and doing things with the transcripts and with the tapes. But we recently engaged in a project called Research Intervention, which came out of a question that we had regarding the literacy practices in the Puerto Rican community in New York. And out of that question came the need to set up an adult literacy project in one of the oldest Puerto Rican communities in New York City, East Harlem. And it was in that context where you link public service and community service with research that we were actually able to continue some of the oral history work, but in a much deeper way than we had ever engaged in before. Because we spent at least 4 years on a weekly basis, in some cases on a daily basis. Our research team was also partly the staff of the program. One of the researchers was the director of the program, so that at the same time that we were providing literacy services, we were conducting a much more ethnographic kind of research practice. And so we were able to get money for actually the service delivery, and that helped in establishing some of the resources. But I think more than the funding was the quality of the research that resulted from that. We were able to, I think, go into considerable depth in understanding how this was mostly with Puerto Rican women who were very, very poor, very marginalized, are mostly on welfare. But we were able to really, through oral history and through their life stories, get a sense of the resources and the contributions and the participation that they have and the contributions they have made to the society, which in a way exploded some of the myths that are out there about underclass, about the culture of poverty, about women who are welfare and called welfare dependents. So some of these rather large issues and myths that stereotype the Puerto Rican community in very detrimental ways, we were able to look at them from another perspective, and from the perspective of how people prioritize family in their lives, and how women have sacrificed most of their life for bringing up their families. So this was...
we have, thanks, Rina. We have some phone calls coming in. Let's try Harrisburg, PA again. Go ahead, Harrisburg. Hello? Hello? See if we can get them in here. We have a call from Western Kentucky. Go ahead. Hello? Okay. We'll keep trying. We'll keep trying. Why don't at this point we look at a videotape that was produced here in Cleveland, produced by Ed Miggins. It's called From Ellis Island to Cleveland, and it's going to show us how Ed has used videotape here in Cleveland to showcase some of the oral history work that's been going on. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll come back and talk about that.
My name is John Chomas. I was born March 1st, 1913. And the place of birth was Ellis Island. At the arrival of a ship coming out of Europe, arrival date was determined by the good Lord himself. It wasn't planned that way, but my mother was coming from Europe to America to meet up with her husband. And as I arrived after 16 days on the ocean, and I was ministered to in the dispensary or hospital facilities that were in place at that time. Those that remember it means a great deal to them. But see, there was a closing in 1954 to the present day. It became a jungle, something that people fought over or whatever, but it was not until Iacocca and a few others took the initiative and brought it back and turned it into the national park system now as a landmark place, a national park. And to those, as I understand the statistics, that as many as 40 million people in this country have a little pipeline or direct line into somebody, aunt, uncle, brother, or father, or person themselves that came through there.
Ellis Island, a land of passage. Ellis Island, a silent stone. Our people battered now with fears, their fields are sown. Help us see in us our riches, help us trade our gold for wishes. Wish to heaven we'd call open shores our home. Wish to heaven we'd call open shores our home.
I was born in a little island called Crete, in the Mediterranean, in a city that was Heraklion. And it's a port city, a very busy area. I was born in 1912. I think my mother and father were married in about 1910. And I never got to know my father there at all. He left in 1914 and came to this country. And I really didn't get to know my father at all, other than seeing pictures of him. Well, the main reason that my dad left the island was because of the conflicts that were being created throughout the whole of Europe. That's when he endeavored to make arrangements and come to this country, because this country was recruiting laborers. They had to build railroads, they had to build other things. As a result, it was an open sesame type of a thing here, and it was very easy for him to sign up and come to this country. My mother was very anxious to meet up with him here, because he described it as a country of freedom, liberty, and everything good. Nothing like it was in the island of Crete. So my mother was daydreaming every day, what a beautiful place to be in. No wars, no conflicts, no jealousies of any sort, just to live in heaven or peace.
I was born in Polish, in Smiatic. I was born in 1907. It was a bad time to leave. They burned the city up. The Russian burned the city. And we were just living in one room, everybody together. Well, it was bad. You didn't have nothing to eat. You had to go to the villages to work. My mother was a dressmaker, so she went to the villages and she worked for the week. And then we used to come home, I went with her, come home and bring home food for the children to eat for the week.
I was born in Poland, Warsaw, Poland, in 1898, November the 3rd. At that time, there was a lot of things going on, yet, if I remember correctly. Jewish people were afraid to walk out and go out. There was, as far as I can remember, they didn't like the Jewish people there. And they did try to have them go or leave or anything. You were scared. We were all scared. Great big Cossacks come into the house with their big coats and their fur hats and their guns, and they tore everything apart. So that's one of the reasons my father, too, knew. He heard of, like his brother that came to America. Why, he told them how nice it's here. To come here, no one is your boss. You can do as you please. And then my father decided he better go to America, because everybody was going to America. I guess he saved enough money, and he sent us tickets. He left 5 little girls when he left. But one died while he was in Cincinnati, this was.
We'll come back and talk a little bit about that tape in a moment, Ed, and get your reaction, some reactions from you about that. First, let's try again to take a phone call. I think we now have a caller from Harrisburg, PA. Harrisburg, are you there?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. This is Barry Loveland from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In 1994, we will celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which many think is the birthplace of the modern gay and lesbian movement. Gay and lesbian organizations in cities all over the United States are working on archives projects and oral history projects. In the face of the epidemic of AIDS and HIV, we are losing many of the leaders of the early days of the gay and lesbian movement. What is the Oral History Association doing to foster this effort?
Thank you. Does anybody want to take a stab at that? I would, I guess, since you put it in the terms of what is the Oral History Association trying to do, the Oral History Association supports all types of projects, and we're willing to provide as much information as we can provide in terms of getting underway, and we can recommend people who might be able to help, and we would love to hear more from you, so you can contact the Oral History Association, and if you have specific questions in terms of what we might do. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
Oh, I think it should be said that I just took a cursory look around the book exhibit this morning, and I think there were a number of books on gay and lesbian movement reflected in the exhibit, and there are some panels at this year's conference on that. I think that the question of AIDS and any kind of testimonial life history work is something that is going on in communities, and I think this is one of the challenges to the association, is to be able to actually connect with the work that's going on in the grassroots, so that in fact the question is not only what is the Oral History Association doing, but how can we in fact link up with projects that are on.
Good. And we have Sherna Gluck in the audience who wants to comment.
I just wanted to comment that there are grassroots gay and lesbian history projects all over the United States, and archives in most of the major cities. People in the community are doing oral histories, and I think that we as individuals very often serve as resources for them. But you're absolutely right, caller, that people are not only dying of AIDS, but also some of the very, very early founders, for instance, some of the early women in Daughters of Bilitis are quite old now. And so I think we do have students as well as people in the community, and we could serve as resources at our various projects.
Thanks, Sherna. We have a call from Western Kentucky. Go ahead, Western Kentucky. Hello?
Hi.
Go ahead.
My name's Sarah Powell, and I have a question for Dr. Birdwhistell. I was wondering, in a place like Kentucky where the Appalachian peoples have been so studied, do you think it is possible to get unsullied history from people, or do you find that many of the people have gained an outside sense of themselves that colors what they may tell you?
That's a good question, and we have an ongoing Appalachian collection in our library at the University of Kentucky, and a lot of our oral history work at the University of Kentucky has involved work in Appalachia, and I think it depends really on the topic that you're studying. I know we did a major project on the Frontier Nursing Service in eastern Kentucky, and going in and interviewing the people about the impact of that medical health care organization in the mountains beginning in 1923, I thought we got some very candid and fascinating information that could only be gotten through oral history. But you're right, the more a place is studied in a community, and we might get a reaction from the panelists here in terms of a place like Appalachia that some people think has been overly studied. You know, there's a comment that some use in the mountains of eastern Kentucky that academics pop in, pop off, and pop out. But, you know, I don't know. That's a good question when it relates to communities. Do you all have anything to add to that?
I'd like to add that primarily with regard to the Appalachian communities, that Native American communities in the Southwest have been the subject of many, many studies, which has virtually turned those communities off to oral historians, for example, or historians of any kind for some period of time. We're seeing now, as we work with communities, that those community histories have to come from within those communities. They cannot come from an anthropologist assigned to do that or a historian assigned to do that. And what we can provide is the resource and the reference tool to be able to do those kinds of histories. And so very much the subject versus the subjective versus the objective look is very important and critical to the success of those programs.
Thanks, Rose. We have a call now from California State University, Fullerton. Go ahead. Hello? Hello? Go ahead.
Question.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you hear me okay? I have a combination question. Does the degree of assimilation into the greater society affect the interviewee's view of being Black American, African American, Mexican American? And how effective has the oral history been in synthesizing these minority expressions into the broader themes that were relate to diversity, national experience?
Thank you. Rina, you want to take a stab at that? Or Rose, in terms of, you know, we're talking about diversity and these distinct groups that are giving us their testimonies and oral histories, but yet they're, as George Wright pointed out in the opening, you know, it's all part of a larger society. So how is that influencing what you find out in the Southwest?
I think that you're always an outsider whenever you participate in any kind of project. You come in with a certain agenda in mind, and by doing that you have already changed or participated in the change of that community. What you can give to the community is a sense of empowerment and a sense of who they are as a people and what they can leave behind for their children, which often has not been left behind for, say, my generation. So for me, the idea of the insider-outsider question is more of I no longer apologize for the passion I have about my community, and that's just the way I approach it. I use all of the technical tools, the research tools, all of the tools that I've been given educationally to do that. But I also have a passion about the communities that I work with, and to me, that's the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Ed, that might say something about Cleveland. You know, some people making fun of Cleveland's recent history, you know, and the troubles that Cleveland has experienced. As you've probably heard, some people blame the problems of Cleveland on the diversity here, the ethnic diversity, that people can't work together. Is that the opposite effect of what that caller was talking about?
That was an older image of Cleveland, that we would become a Tower of Babel at the turn of the century, and there was a neighborhood behind Higbee's which was called a Babel of Tongues because there were over 40 nationality groups there. But what we often do in the research is not only empower the groups, but try to get groups to communicate their cultural richness and what they have in common with other people. We put together a play called The Peoples of Cleveland, where we had 40 interviews of a wide variety of European, African, Latino, and Asian groups. And what we often do is bring the oral history play and a photo exhibit around to the different communities so they break through that isolation. We often have residential isolation. I think we're the second most segregated city in America today. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do is go into minority communities with plays that not only speak about their history, but about the histories of other groups, so they can see the commonality of the struggle for jobs and neighborhoods and good schools for their children. And we often bring in the play to communities that are going through racial integration. We brought our play on the Peoples of Cleveland into Garfield Heights and Maple Heights. These are outer ring suburban communities that are going through racial integration for the first time, dealing with many of the issues that oral historians have dealt with in terms of being a community that's going through a racial integration that many people in Cleveland fear. I mean, so what we try to do is try to get people to understand the history of their groups as well as other groups in the city, so they break down this sense of isolation and fear that they have about one another.
Good, good.
I'd like to add just a little footnote to that.
We have a caller coming in. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Which is that in many ways the old assimilation paradigm that applied to European ethnic groups may not apply anymore to newer migrations, or newer immigration, and also to representing the realities of Native peoples. And so that when we talk about diversity and we talk about integration and commonality, we have to also have a different attitude towards difference. Mm-hmm. That difference is not necessarily a divisive force, but that in some ways, if we look at difference in a more positive way, that we could think of a different set of terms of association, mm-hmm. so that the assimilation paradigm may not be the only paradigm at our reach.
Let me take this call from Hawaii, and go ahead, Hawaii. Hello?
Yes, this is Alice Chair from Honolulu, Hawaii. I'm doing videotaping on former Bishop Wright who came to Hawaii from Korea. And when they talk about their sexuality, especially extramarital or post-marital sexuality, and they have children of very diverse or spacing, great age differences. And I asked them how these children came about. And they said, turn off the record player. And they said they had affairs with other men. But how can I present this kind of experience of sexuality in my videotaping? Because they told me off the record, and they want me to present as anonymous, some kind of storytelling.
Got it.
I didn't understand the question. Does anybody in the audience want to? Did you all hear it out there? Could someone come to the mic and summarize that for us? Because we couldn't hear it up here. Go ahead.
I believe what the woman said is that she's been doing some interviews with people, and I didn't catch what the population, Koreans, and that in talking about their sexuality and that there were spaces between the births of children, and she would address that. How was it that there was this space, this age difference, and that the person being interviewed then asks that the tape be turned off. And they tell her off the record that they had affairs with other men besides their husband. And she wants to know how she's videotaping this. How can she capture this information in her videotape?
Who wants to take a stab at that?
I'll be happy.
Ed?
I think above all we have to respect the person that we're interviewing, and I've heard from immigrants some very deep personal problems as to why their families arrived at different periods of time, and I respect that, and I feel like it's an obligation of the oral historian not only to respect it, but for the next generation to come. And whenever we do an oral history tape, we make a transcript, we send it back to the family, and they have a right to look at this and to tell us that perhaps there are things that they said that they would not like to be in our permanent public archives. So I really think this is a very serious issue for any oral historian. And above all, I think the trust that is established with the person that you're interviewing has to be maintained by clear communication as to what they want left as the record of that experience. And I don't think we have any right whatsoever to intrude on people and violate that trust and privacy in their family.
All right. Well, we're about out of time for this session. I have about 100 other questions I'd like to ask you. And Rose, learn more about what you're doing in the schools out in New Mexico. And Rina, hear more about your project. And, of course, Ed's we could talk about for a long time. I want to thank the callers who have been calling in. You can see that the questions we receive around the country really prompt a better discussion. And I appreciate the questions we've been getting from the studio audience. And Ed and Rina and Rose, thank you for appearing with us today. And you all will be in the studio audience if people have additional questions. It's a 10-minute break we're going to be taking. Then we're going to come back with a different panel, and we want you to continue to call and ask these good questions that are coming in from around the country. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be right back.
That was a good comment.
Welcome back to this afternoon's video conference, Communities, Diversity, and Oral History. I'm Tom Charlton from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. I worked with the Oral History Institute there, and I'm this year's immediate past president of the Oral History Association. You've seen several panelists on our program this afternoon, and during this part of the video conference, we'll meet other individuals, and you'll have opportunities to talk with them through telephone communications. For the next minute, I'd like to mention something to you that is available now from the Oral History Association. It is a new pamphlet that has just been published by the Oral History Association. The title is Using Oral History in Community History Projects. The authors are Laurie Mercier and Madeline Buckendorf. This is one of the titles in our pamphlet series, Practical Works for Oral Historians of all types. There are other titles available through the association, but this one has just come off the press. And we want to urge viewers throughout the areas that are seeing us today and may see us later on videotape to obtain this new title from the Oral History Association directly. Please do not use the 800 number that we have in effect this afternoon, for we are not able to take your call and order today, but use the address that will be on the screen, the Oral History Association's address in Los Angeles at UCLA, please. But let me urge you to obtain this latest publication from the Oral History Association that is on the subject of today's video conference. The topic for this part of our video conference is a little bit more specific than we have seen in the immediate preceding period. We want to talk about communities in crisis now for just a little while. And I want to reintroduce George Wright from the University of Texas at Austin. You saw him earlier and heard from him. And who is on my immediate left, and to his left is Richard Candida Smith. Richard Candida Smith plays a very special role for all of us in oral history in the United States in particular. He is the Executive Secretary of the Oral History Association. He is a member of the faculty and staff at the UCLA Oral History Program. And Richard, we're glad to have you on this part of the program this afternoon. And I hope both of you will participate fully. By telephone in just a moment, we'll be talking with Wesley H. Henderson, who is a Los Angeles oral historian and architect. He is also a doctoral candidate in architectural history at UCLA. And before we bring Wes in, let me ask you, Richard, for just a moment, to think about your oral history program back home at UCLA, and how did you get started in working with people such as Wes Henderson, our friend that we'll talk with in just a moment?
Well, I think we have to look at the history of a program such as UCLA, which is very typical of a certain kind of university oral history project. We were started in 1959 to document the history of California, primarily by focusing on interviewing significant leaders of the California community, primarily the Southern California community. That meant business leaders, politicians, artists and writers, and architects. I came to the program in 1984. In that period of time, which is the first 25 years of the program's history, we had interviewed a little over 200 people, of which the people of color could be counted on the fingers of one hand. So there was a certain kind of interpretation of the history of California and Los Angeles that was being put forward in that collection, which is that the important people, the important leaders of the community had all been of European American ancestry, or practically all. Yet there were clues in the interviews that this was in fact inaccurate, that if one looked at the political interviews, that African Americans had played a central role in the political life of the city long before Tom Bradley was elected mayor in 1973, I believe. But for 3 decades previous, the black business leaders and religious leaders had been part of the electoral coalitions that had influenced who was chosen as mayor. So we decided to begin focused interviews in other areas of the Los Angeles community, Los Angeles experience.
This was a fairly typical situation. Some other oral history programs have begun by interviewing white or other ethnic groups. George, you probably know of a lot of other oral history programs that have started with leaders in their communities or in business or institutions, but then you shifted and changed course.
Well, we expanded our course. We continued interviewing the various types of people we had been interviewing, but to do it in a more expansive way, so that one looked at the total leadership and not simply a narrow segment of the leadership, because certainly there were black politicians, there were Mexican, American businessmen, etc. And since much of our collection, in fact 40% of our collection relates to the fine arts, there were also writers and artists and architects. And so we began to interview intensively in this area, part as a catch-up and part simply to get that important part of the history.
Let's bring Wes in on our discussion this afternoon. Wes, we're really glad you can join us from your home in the Los Angeles area. Let's start, Wes, by our asking you, from your perspective, how did you become a part of the UCLA oral history work?
Basically, they sought me out. They asked me. Hello?
We're not able to hear Wes at the moment.
Hello? Hello? This is Wes Henderson. Am I on the line?
I
think it's coming. You can hear it.
All right. Yes, you're on, Wes. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I can hear you. Basically, they came and found me. That is, that I was doing research on African American architects, and with the goal of doing a dissertation on one or two. And because of my work, I came to the attention of Dale Trelevin, the director, and so he called me and asked me if I would like to participate with the program. And I received training in oral history from the program, and then discussed with Trelevin criteria on selection, and with him and with the program, then decided on who we would select, and then went out and did the interviews.
Thanks, Wes. What have you done with the UCLA program lately?
Well, I interviewed 5 African American architects, and I would like to talk about the selection criteria, because when Trelevin first talked to me about the program, he had only 2 or 3 African American potential candidates, and I immediately told him, well, I know 75, and it occurred to me right then that what happens is that in our society there are different networks that happen, partly due to past segregation, partly due to whatever habits have arisen over time. But the majority culture really had not known about or respected organizations within the minority communities and didn't know about them. So that I am a very active member of the African American Architects Association, and as secretary, I knew all of them. I had all their addresses. So when I told him I had 75, I had addresses, I had phone numbers, he was just shocked. So then we had to come up with criteria to bring that number 75 down to a manageable number, to see, who were we going to interview and why, and who was significant, and etc. So there was some negotiation there between deciding who from the majority point of view was significant and who from the minority point of view was significant. And usual criteria is large buildings and costly buildings and people that have a certain kind of career. Well, that really did not apply or I could not apply that as much in my selection criteria. So the selection criteria really became fairly subjective between myself and Trelevin.
If I could ask a little bit more direct question, Wes. How has it affected your work as an oral historian now? Maybe not as much as an architect, although I'm sure you can't separate the two always. How has it affected your work that Los Angeles has gone through a period of considerable crisis in the last couple of years? How has this affected your oral history work in terms of its content, or the texture of it, or the focus of your work?
Actually, it hasn't really affected it at all. That is that, from my point of view, I was looking at a professional community of architects and not necessarily a geographic community. But from a different perspective, my work as an oral historian has now gotten around town, and people are seeing value in that work, and especially because some buildings were destroyed in the rebellion. They want to very tangibly, they see that history has to be preserved, and so I have become an informal consultant to different groups around town, trying to raise their consciousness level about oral history and just documentation of the history of the community. We see it now as fragile because physically it burned up in front of us.
Wes, George Wright has a question for you.
Certainly.
Hello, Wes. I'm George Wright from the University of Texas, and over the years in working on various projects on Kentucky, I will read a newspaper and they will be focusing on someone black, and they'll say this is the first black to do whatever in that regard, and then I would come to find out through oral interviews that there had actually been black people, let's say at the turn of the century, 1890s or whatever, doing some of these things, and it might be actually the first black in 60 years. And it just raises the question to me, how far back can you go in documenting the presence of black architects in a place like Los Angeles, in a place like California, and how did they survive over the years? What kind of projects that they work on? Some of those kind of things would be of interest to me.
Okay. I would like to break your question up into two parts in that I also run into this sort of myth about first black this and first black that, and I try to be very careful with saying this is the first black someone. Really, I think that consciousness is one that is looking at the black community's relationship to the white community. This is the first black to do this from the point of view of the majority community or interact with the white community. Okay. And what that also says is that history is not well transmitted or preserved about activities of the African American community. That is that because someone did things 50, 60, 70 years ago and they weren't well preserved, then now we see what happened in the 60s and 70s as first. In fact, to me, I don't even see being first as always important, but for some others, both in the community and outside the community, they see being the first black as important. Then second, I often hear from, let's say, the majority perspective that they, quote, can't find qualified black people to do whatever, or et cetera. And I feel that also indicates that they aren't really tied into networks that are within the black community. They're black people. They're probably doing, functioning, handling any number of tasks that could probably meet the qualifications of who they're looking for. Then, now this is getting to the projects you asked. From my research, there were black architects in Los Angeles before the turn of the right after the turn of the century. In particular, I'm looking at Paul R. Williams, who started his career in 1915. And the projects that African American architects worked on fall into several categories. One, within their own community, churches, institutions, the YMCA, small businesses, funeral homes, insurance companies, etc. Later on, this mix changes to include government projects, city agencies, etc., because in the private sector there is a certain amount of discrimination in the majority community. But in the 1915, 1920 era, you didn't have government projects per se that were using African American architects.
Wes, we have a telephone call that we might take at this point, if I could break in for a moment. We have a call from Western Kentucky University. Please go ahead, caller. Hello? Do we have our caller from Western Kentucky? Okay, well, apparently we do have another little technical problem. Did you want to respond to Wes's comment?
I appreciate his comments, especially about what they were able to do in the Afro-American community over the years. I guess the last aspect of that, Wes, where did these people receive their training, and were they trained in the same conventional ways, whatever that may mean, of let's say white architects at the turn of the century? And so I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And in fact, your whole discussion has raised something that I've just not been aware of in looking at blacks in, let's say, in Kentucky and the South. I cannot think of a black architect going back as far as you can.
I don't know of black architects in Kentucky. However, we're running into a problem of semantics too. There are many black builders and carpenters who erected buildings and who had certainly the experience to design a building, but because they either could not qualify to take the license examination or through any number of means, they did not qualify to get the title architect.
Okay.
In California, in my research, I made a distinction between people who immigrated into California and those who were here as natives. Okay. Immigrants into California, of course, can get training in any number of places. The native Californians tended to get their training out here in California, that is, that they didn't go anyplace else. And so you don't have African-American universities and a large African-American community in which they can receive their training. So in many ways, they were trained pretty much like the majority community, trained in an integrated setting.
Okay.
But still, their primary client base was in the African-American community.
Richard Smith has a comment for you, Wes. Excuse me just a moment.
Well, I just wanted to point out it's my understanding that in terms of the interviews that we did, 3 of the 5 initial architects were doing a lot of work for government, right? And we're doing work that dominant culture architects would be doing. But then we did the very interesting interview with Lester Bankhead, who was much more of an indigenous architect, indigenous to the community.
Yes, that's correct. But I also need to make a distinction here that the interviews I am conducting are with people that generally were born in the 1920s. Okay. And then they came to the peak of their careers just after World War II, let's say 1945. Okay. Several of them graduated from architectural schools, and in fact on the GI Bill, through the GI Bill. And what these interviews helped me do for my research is that I was really looking for information about the generation ahead of them. And so the interviews gave me wonderful anecdotes, stories, remembrances about architects that my group that I actually interviewed, they had worked with the older architects or knew of them or et cetera. So when I talk about projects that African-American architects were working on in the 1500s, 1920s, that, of course, is coming through the filter of the generation that I'm actually interviewing.
Wes, let's try our phone call again. I think we may have Western Kentucky on the line. Please go ahead. Hello? Do we have our caller from Kentucky? Hello? Okay, well, we tried on that. We do have a question from the audience here, and please go right ahead.
Art Hansen from Cal State University at Fullerton. And my question relates to a couple of things that George Wright said earlier. One is that oral history is used not only to gain information about the past, but to provide us with some useful information that will help in public policy formation. And the other thing he said is that one of the things we would be hearing about today in terms of multiculturality are what people who have been interviewed in different communities are thinking about multiculturality. That is a public policy issue today. I'm finding that students in my class treat it as a rather brittle topic and are very edgy and sometimes impatient with the infusion of multicultural perspectives into the curriculum, whether in lectures or whether in assigned books or even with oral history topics. some of those students are out there observing this conference today. They're going to write a 5-page critique on the conference. Can you give them a little help on that?
He's talking to Wes? Or?
Well, talking to you, George, or anybody else who is on the committee today.
Take it, George.
Well, actually, there are so many things you can say about that, in the sense that, like you, my students today are faced with the fact that that they're involved in an issue that they find very hotly debated, very controversial, that all of them will acknowledge that we do need to know more about other groups of people. But a lot of times I think they come from backgrounds that have not prepared them well to do that. For instance, though we think about school integration as something that has been mandatory in American society, and again, I'll just use Texas as an example, and I suspect it's true for a lot of other places. I have white students at the University of Texas who graduate from high schools that will have a 500-person graduating class, and there will be absolutely no blacks and maybe no Mexican Americans in that class. I will have some black students from the inner city of Houston or Dallas that you could say a similar thing to, and then they come to a university like ours, and that's their first interracial experience. And then they're put in a situation where one of the big debates today is differences and things like that. And a lot of times I've decided that students can actually be sincere, though uninformed about many things. In fact, I've said on many occasions to some black students that when they become frustrated at comments white students have made about black people or something like that, I said, is it really fair in every instance to assume that a white person, just because they didn't say exactly what we wanted to hear about this issue, does it mean they're insensitive? No, it might mean that because they've come from a predominantly white background where they're members of the majority group, they might not have spent as much time thinking about race as you and I, black people in a certain environment, have been. And so consequently, what I would argue is that we have to find a way to allow them to speak, to challenge them, and maybe we can educate and move all of us down the road. I would also argue that sometimes on campuses like ours, where blacks or Mexican Americans or Asian Americans are in a minority, members of the majority group won't challenge them. They will say, well, if a black student says something, well, they're speaking from feelings and that has to be some truth in it. Well, they too have to be challenged in what they believe. So though it's often highly emotional, it's rather volatile at times, but I actually think the good is that maybe we can show all of our students a certain commonality that they have, that they're on our campuses to learn about the differences and to learn about themselves as well. One of the things that so troubles me, and I try to be as neutral as I can on these things, is that I would argue to all of our students that sometimes we label ourselves too narrowly, i.e. I'm a black person or a student or by someone's sexual preference and so on down the line. I will respect people's right to do that, but in doing it, they cut themselves off. And that's one of the things I think we have to remind all of our students, to try to find the commonality between themselves and their classmates, not so much always just the differences between themselves.
Richard, did you want to respond to the question from the audience?
No. Well, in terms of the collection development at the UCLA program, we were starting from basically a zero base. And to talk about multiculturality in the context of the kinds of interviews we were doing and have started to do required going into different professional groups and ethnic groups and finding out people's experiences within those groups. And it might not mean that there was a lot of experience particularly for that generation, of diversity, that one is still focusing in on.
How receptive were they?
Oh, everyone's receptive, I would say. There was no, in terms of we started out by setting up an advisory group of people from the African American community to identify key leaders in the civil rights movement, political leaders, and religion that we should interview. In terms of the interviewing African American artists, we went we decided to approach it a little differently, which was to look at the key institutions that developed, that started actually in the 1960s.
Let me break in just long enough to read the question that was just handed to me, and this one is from Western Kentucky. The question from the caller that we were not able to hear is, how does research that we have done in the past affect the present? What links do you see, George?
Okay. Again, just using my own work as an example, I've spent a considerable amount of time just trying to look at the concept of whether our legal system has been fair to black people in that regard. And I looked at that in the past, not in the present. And yet, I think not what it shows us is historical patterns. It can show us a certain amount of continuity. And also, I think by looking and understanding the past, and especially the legacies that people have inherited, can show, for instance, a certain amount of distrust that maybe our minority communities might often have with our legal system, or if nothing else, a certain amount of cynicism they may have. And so consequently, I think that is very useful. Some issues in the past can enlighten us on that. And also, there's a flip side to that. Sometimes when we become very aware of a social or whatever issue today, we can assume that it's completely new, but then we can, with a certain eye, then look back to the past. I take the issue of child abuse, for instance, as an example, something that when I started graduate school in the 70s, I don't remember any scholars talking about, but as we've become more aware of that in our society today, we've been able to ask new questions of our past, and lo and behold, we find out tragically that many instances of child abuse and other kind of family violence have a long history in our country and the world.
I'm sorry to have to cut us off, but this part of our video conference is rapidly winding down, and we want to thank Wes Henderson for being with us this afternoon, and I want to thank Richard Smith and George Wright for joining me on the panel.
I would like to say to West, as we close, you're doing very outstanding work. I think that's one aspect of Afro-American history that scholars have not spent much time looking at, so I would encourage you to go ahead and finish your dissertation.
Thank you very much.
For our viewers, we have an interesting videotape, and I want to thank our panel again. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, we processed out of Cameron Bay, and I got to see a little country, seen Tokyo. Got into Lexington. I just caught a bus on in. Well, hell, I was tickled to death to get home. And got up here on New Road Hill, and the damn state police pulled the bus over. Here I said, goddamn, I come up here jumping off the bus and walking. They sat there for an hour.
What the hell they pulled the bus over?
Oh, hell, he done something wrong. There I said, goddamn big copper tone tan, big camera on the... I couldn't get out, couldn't get to the house.
That sucker.
I couldn't believe it.
But you finally made it on home.
I finally got in here.
It's hard to make adjustments. You know, I think one thing, we move too fast. I've thought about this several times. From the time I left Pleiku, I'm sitting on a hill in 48 hours. You know, your body's here, but your mind is still over there. I mean, that was hard to adjust to. And I tried to go on back to work and just forget about this experience. It didn't happen. It was a nightmare, and let's forget about it. But it didn't work that easy, though. I found that when I got back, a lot of things had changed.
Well, I guess, you know, we're going through the, you know, the rocket attacks and the ground attacks. I'm very thankful to be alive, and I never was a very patriotic person, you know, before I was in the military, and now, you know, when they play the national anthem or whatnot, I got cold chills running down my spine, and I'm a whole lot more outspoken now, and a lot of people will tell you that. And I don't have much patience, and a lot of people tell you that too. And you know, sometimes I have a hard time dealing with people that are not Vietnam veterans, or people that know I am and they're not. Maybe it's just me, but After about 10 years, it seemed like the first 10 years I didn't really think about Nam that much. There's always something that comes into your mind, or maybe you have a bad dream one night, or something. You'll be driving down the road and the song will come on that was playing back then, and but now it's getting more and more, seems like, at least to me. I don't know how to get it. I mean, doing the monument helped me tremendously. It helped me, it really did. And then going to Washington helped too. When I don't feel as much guilt, I guess, after I saw the wall in D.C. and I saw my friends' names on it, and then I looked up the 7 here from Montgomery County, and it was a real touching, emotional weekend for me, and that helped tremendously.
What were you feeling guilty about?
I don't know. Well, I do too. I guess guilty that I came back. That I made it and some of my friends didn't. I feel fortunate that I did, but sometimes I just, I feel guilty that I didn't make it.
I don't know. I can't understand the first part. I can't understand why the people who opposed the war treated the veteran badly. It wasn't the veteran went and fought because he was ordered to by his country, by his government. I can't understand why they blamed the veteran. Should have blamed the government. It's just bad thinking. I don't understand either one of them.
Do you see it changing?
Yeah, but it's easy now, isn't it? All those people who were shouting and carrying the signs have calmed down. Hell, they even wear suits and ties, some of them now. Some of them you can't find anymore. They're selling insurance. And so it's far enough away now so it's not so painful, and we've matured, and we realize now, everybody realizes the war was a mistake, almost everybody. So it's easier now.
And they would say, man, when you get back, it's going to be great. You won't be able to buy a beer for yourself. Nobody will bother to ID you, even though in most states the drinking age is 21. And we really thought we were going back to not ticker tape parades, because we were coming back one at a time as opposed to thousands at a time like at the end of World War II. But we came back to get insulted and spit upon and rocks thrown at us, kicked out of places. Hey, get out of here, you crazy son of a bitch. You went to Vietnam. Well, hey, 12 months ago this was okay. Now it's not. That's why I think a lot of vets have had a lot of problems. Is we were expecting one thing and we got another. And there's even back here in the bathroom, there's some graffiti on the wall that says, "I came back to the wrong world." That was an expression in Vietnam. Was going back to the world meant coming back home. And that's what it says in there. I came back to the wrong world. Life sucks.
We don't want to be recognized as Vietnam veterans. We want to be recognized as veterans, which I'm sure we are. Like I said before, it don't matter which country you get shot in, it hurts just as bad. If it's Japan, Germany, it hurts. When you get shot, I mean, it bleeds, yeah, it's red too, and even over there it's red. And we're just veterans. And I think they give us a raw deal. They still do. That's about it. They give us a raw deal, and they still do.
In this panel, we're going to be discussing the topic dealing with diversity in our communities. I want to encourage you again to call our 800 number. Even though we're having a few technical difficulties, we really do want to hear from you. It makes the program more vibrant. We also want to hear more questions from our studio audience as we have time to work those in. Let me introduce the new people who have joined us for this panel. On my right is Kathleen Blee. Kathy is the Associate Professor in Sociology at the University of Kentucky. She writes and researches in the field of historical sociology. In her recent book, Women of the Klan, Racism and Gender in the 1920s, uses oral history to study the subject of Klan in Indiana. And Kathy is a featured speaker at this conference here in Cleveland. She'll be our luncheon speaker tomorrow, and we're looking forward to her talk, Evidence, Empathy, and Dilemmas of an Oral History of the Klan. So we might even want to ask her a little bit more about that in a few minutes. On my left is Sherna Gluck, and Sherna is the coordinator of the Oral History program at California State University, Long Beach, and professor of women's studies. Those of us who are heavily involved in oral history know Sherna's work very well. She is the author of Rosie the Riveter Revisited, and she is co-author of the recent book, Women's Words, The Feminist Practice of Oral History, which has been such an important work for those of us interested in oral history. And also joining us again on this panel is George Wright from the University of Texas. I want to start out our discussion in this panel. We've talked about communities as a geographical boundary, as a way to separate people by ethnicity. Sherna, you have some thoughts about how we might expand how we think about communities.
Well, I don't know if it's to expand how we think about communities so much as to sort of offer a critique of the concept of community. To go back to some of the points George made earlier. I think that very often what's called community is what the dominant society defines as the other, and that defines the parameters of a community, so that there is the African American community, and the complexity and the diversity within is not accounted for. Now this can get us into very serious problems, not only in terms of scholarship, but in terms of involvement in community research. And I just want to use an example. My campus sits in the heart of the largest Cambodian community outside of Phnom Penh, in Long Beach. And it is a very divided community. The world outside, including the city of Long Beach, sees it as the Cambodian community. But when one group in the community came to us to help them to do oral histories in the community, we ran into big problems because other organizations in the community were in competition. It's a very political community, leaving aside the major political divisions inside Cambodia. And in an interesting sort of way, it's an example of the way in which, as outsiders, the university became a neutral ground. So the issue of where would these be deposited if we did them? If we use certain students who would be affiliated with one part of the community, then other members of the community would not agree to be interviewed. So it perhaps is a more dramatic case, but I think it's true of all communities. And what happens is by using the word community, and particularly by the outsiders using the word community, it levels it as if there is a community. And I think that's true of every context. It's true, for instance, in certainly something we know from women's history. Women are not a unitary, transcendent category any more than the African American or Irish American or the sort of clan community. So I have real problems about the way that we've been talking about community, really, because I think it's the outside that defines the community, that levels these distinctions. I want to say one other thing about language, and I suppose it has to do with what I call a different kind of community, and that's the community of feminist scholars, and people who work in ethnic history, in working class history. We act as if there's women's history, there's Afro-American history, there's other ethnic history, and then there is the other history, the real history, right? Some of my colleagues who don't like our work, that's the real history. I think that what we're doing is creating a community in which we're creating space to really be at the cutting edge of new scholarship. But the goal, and I want to go back to something that George said earlier, but the goal is to use that to then integrate and transform the rest of the discipline, so that we simultaneously work at both levels. But indeed, we are a community of scholars, and that is a different kind of community, too. And there are real divisions within our own community of scholars, too.
Kathy, we've heard a lot from historians and oral historians. You describe yourself as a historical sociologist, and certainly the term community is not foreign to sociologists. How did you react to this discussion of communities and diversities from the perspective of a historical sociologist?
I agree with what's been said, that community is a term that we've used probably too loosely and that can cover up and really disguise a lot of what we really want to know. For example, in my work on the Klan in the 1920s, I was interested in the Klan as a political community. But in doing oral histories and in digging into that history of the Klan, what you find out is that that term, political community even, is misleading, that there were gender divisions within the Klan, and that very tragic, terrible part of American history doesn't represent a unified community of political activists on the right, that even that is a divided. So I think even within organizations like the Klan, I think we can be misled politically by seeing them as a unified, one-dimensional community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In terms of your work on women in the Klan in Indiana, you're going to be talking about that in some detail tomorrow at our luncheon. What can you tell us today in kind of a summary in terms of how oral history, how you dealt with the oral history process in your work in Indiana?
I interviewed people who had been active in the Klan, in the men's Klan or the women's Klan, or even in the children's auxiliaries of the Klan. The people I interviewed, since this was the Klan in 1920, were quite elderly when I interviewed them in the 1980s and have almost all subsequently died. People were disturbingly happy to be interviewed, and I guess if there's one ethical question that I bring and that I still find unresolved, is that very one. We've talked about oral history as empowering, and I believe that it is. History is an empowering vehicle to give to people, and when you're talking about doing oral histories of people who are involved in hate movements, I think it raises some real difficult issues about bringing forth that history so that we can understand hate and we can oppose it, but not so we can empower contemporary hate groups.
Interesting dilemma.
How did you come across, how did you get the names of the various people to interview? Since they were in an organization in the 1920s and you interviewed them in the 1980s, how were you able to get your leads?
I sent out notices asking for people to be interviewed, and I sent them out in all kinds of newspapers and historical societies across a part of Indiana that had a lot of Klan activity. I would say one of my best sources, though, was putting notices in nursing home bulletins, since given the age of these people, and I got people who then self-selected to be interviewed.
We have a question from California State University, Fullerton. How critical are social and ethical commonalities or differences between interviewer and interviewee? Who would like to take a crack at that? Sherna?
How critical are they? I think it's, we're in different kinds of positions with regard to the people we interview and they to us. I draw on my experience partially, well, in two sorts of projects. One, some work that I'm doing with a group of students on challenging and revisioning the history and historiography of contemporary feminism, so that it becomes more inclusive. Now, I myself was very active in the women's liberation movement. And I'm also very critical of how that history's been written, how it's been written in some recent books, so that it excludes the movements of women of color. It denies the possibility of even challenging the periodization of contemporary feminism if we become more inclusive, etc. So I think that we stand in that project, I stand in several different kinds of relationships to the project and to the other people we will be interviewing. When I interviewed Johnny Tillman, who was one of the founders, who was the founder of one of the first welfare mothers, grassroots welfare mothers organizations in the country, and later became involved in the National Welfare Rights Organization, I stand in relationship to her and to her movement as someone who probably, not personally, but embodied the criticism of the women's liberation movement at the same time that I stand in a critical position vis-a-vis that movement. In the interviews I've done in Palestine, I'm simultaneously, obviously I'm an outsider, on several counts I'm an outsider, but in terms of the political work I've been doing, I'm an insider. And it enables me sometimes, in fact, despite my own very early prescription that you should usually be part of the group that you're interviewing, there are things that the women will talk to me about that, amazingly, even with an interpreter there, they would not necessarily talk with another insider about. And it's become very clear to me in certain contexts from the reaction of the interpreter why that would be the case. And it usually has to do with if you are in some way challenging or even subtly questioning the traditional values of a culture, it's much easier to talk to an outsider about that, because I'm not part of the culture who might be judging her on those grounds. So I think we stand in so many complicated ways in relationship to the people we interview, and what we have to do is be self-conscious of the complexity of that positioning.
Good. We have another question from Western Kentucky University, and we certainly appreciate Western Kentucky being so active in this video conference. We want to encourage the other sites to call in also. This question, I think, relates to all three of your all's work in the sense that are there established methods for checking the accuracy of oral history, and put it in the context of the fact that we're trying, in your all's writing, you're trying to bring a history into the mainstream that's been left out, and you're using a lot of oral history. It can be attacked as not accurate, as hearsay, and all that type of thing. How do you deal with that as scholars who use this community-based oral history that's being developed to present that history and make it acceptable?
Let me give a shot at that. In my book on racial violence in Kentucky, I decided that I would take a very conservative approach in counting the number of people who had been victimized by lynch mobs. If you look in the standard books that mention lynchings, they will say that 205 people were lynched in the state of Kentucky over the years, and my conservative count came up with 353. Now, on any number of occasions, I had people through oral accounts tell me stories of people who had been lynched at such and such a place at such and such a time, and I decided that I would not use that as the only source, that I would have to find some newspaper, something to help. There are government records on occasion that would help verify that. Now, interestingly, on a number of occasions, I started out knowing nothing more than the oral account, and it led me to any number of others, and so, but on a few occasions I could not follow it all the way through, and so I did not use those. That was to make people understand that the 353 I could document were in fact legitimate. But I have no doubt in my mind that the oral interviews really were accurate in some instances, but unfortunately they could not be documented otherwise. And it's really not surprising, because by the 1940s a lot of lynchings are, quote, gone underground, and so people did not want those known widely. So, but I did that as a way of trying to show that I would be as critical of using oral interviews as I would any other source. And I might add, there were some instances where people told me things that I just cannot believe, that even though I want to say, okay, there were a lot of lynchings, but on some occasions when people told me there were 10 people lynched at such and such a time, I knew that was just not accurate, and I refused to buy into that.
We have a question from Howard Payne University. To what extent has the resurgence of Native American demands played a role in our new interest in cultural diversity studies? Have you all run into this at your universities or in your work? The demands of Native Americans.
Well, actually, on our campus, the Native American voice has probably been muted in our discussion of diversity and multiculturality. It's been incorporated, but on most of our campuses, except probably at New Mexico and a few other places in the country, there is really, unfortunately, a very, very small percentage of American Indian students. And they are much less visible, but I think they're certainly part of the whole move to challenge traditional historiography, to challenge the traditional canons in all sorts of ways. I think that obviously the 1492 has heightened focus on the American Indians, but I think that I view it as all part of our same challenge of the conception of history in general.
Rose Diaz has a comment from the audience now.
Let me address that from the point of view of the University of New Mexico, and again, the quincentennial celebration of accommodation, at least in New Mexico, has brought some things forward with certainly discussions whether Native American communities were participating, not participating. With regard to oral histories, what has happened is that we're beginning to see some of the elder statesmen of political movements, such as Dennis Banks, establishing archives with us. And establishing not only personal archives, but establishing an AIM movement archive, which he is soliciting materials for. So there is a strong base, whether you agree or disagree with the movement, it certainly had an influence and an impact on the political aspect within that period. And we're beginning to see more and more discussion, at least with regard to Native American communities, about taking on and empowering their own communities to tell their own stories from their point of view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kathy, how would you have gone about writing your book without oral history? How different would your book have been without the interviews?
I think I couldn't have written it without the oral interviews. The history of the Klan has been primarily written as a history of the men's Klan, mm-hmm. and there are very few documentary sources having to do with the women's Klan, and oral history was really a route into understanding that women played a role in that, but I think even larger, a route into understanding how much larger the 1920s Klan was than we thought, how much more powerful they were, and ultimately how much more destructive they were. Some of the understandings that I came to about what women did in the Klan, the destructive boycotts, getting people fired from their jobs, mm-hmm. Were activities that don't show up in written sources very well. Some of them I later could confirm by clues in the oral histories I could confirm in written sources, but there are things that were lost to history without that point of entree.
Mm-hmm. Good. I understand we have a call from Hawaii. We're going to try and bring that in. Hello, Hawaii. Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we can't understand that. Let's go to a question from the studio audience.
Well, I'd just like to.
To what extent has the resurgence of Native American demands played a role in our new interest in cultural diversity studies? Have you all run into this at your universities or in your work? The demands of Native Americans.
Well, actually, on our campus, the Native American voice has probably been muted in our discussion of diversity and multiculturality. It's been incorporated, but on most of our campuses, except probably New Mexico and a few other places in the country, there is really, unfortunately, a very, very small percentage of American Indian students. And they are much less visible, but I think they're certainly part of the whole move to challenge traditional historiography, to challenge the traditional canons in all sorts of ways. I think that obviously the 1492 has heightened focus on the American Indians, but I think that I view it as all part of our same challenge of the conception of history in general.
Rose Diaz has a comment from the audience now.
Let me address that from the point of view of the University of New Mexico, and again, the quincentennial celebration or accommodation, at least in New Mexico, has brought some things forward with certainly discussions whether Native American communities were participating, not participating. With regard to oral histories, what has happened is that we're beginning to see some of the elder statesmen of political movements, such as Dennis Banks, establishing archives with us. And establishing not only personal archives, but establishing an AIM movement archive, which he is soliciting materials for. So there is a strong base, whether you agree or disagree with the movement, it certainly had an influence and an impact on the political aspect within that period. And we're beginning to see more and more discussion, at least with regard to Native American communities, about taking on and empowering their own communities to tell their own stories from their point of view.
Good. Kathy, how would you have gone about writing your book without oral history? How different would your book have been without the interviews?
I think I couldn't have written it without the oral interviews. The history of the Klan has been primarily written as a history of the men's Klan, and there are very few documentary sources having to do with the women's Klan, and oral history was really a route into understanding that women played a role in that, but I think even larger, a route into understanding how much larger the 1920s Klan was than we thought, how much more powerful they were, and ultimately how much more destructive they were. Some of the understandings that I came to about what women did in the Klan, the destructive boycotts, getting people fired from their jobs, were activities that don't show up in written sources very well. Some of them I later could confirm by clues in the oral histories I could confirm in written sources, but there are things that were lost to history without that point of entree.
Good. I understand we have a call from Hawaii. We're going to try and bring that in. Hello, Hawaii. Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we can't understand that. Let's go to a question from the studio audience.
Well, I'd just like to say that despite Montana's inclement weather yesterday, I did manage to get here. One of the things that's been discussed all through this conference is how people, interviewers of similar background and heritage, and often gender, contribute to a stronger response and perhaps better collection of information than the outsider. However, one of the things that I would like to have addressed is perhaps sometimes the fact that it's an insider on an insider, that certain issues that would be of interest to the greater segment of society are ignored.
Okay. Anybody want to respond to that?
Well, I think we have to talk about what are the goals of our projects. And it goes back to the question of verifiability, too. For instance, I'm not as concerned about verifiability because I'm looking for meaning and representation. How women represent their lives, for instance. But how we define the project, what we want from the project, what the goal is really critical. And I think when we're doing community history, we have to be defining the goal with the community. And that may mean that the questions that the outside community is interested in may or may not get addressed. I'm not sure that just because you're an outsider, you will address them. I think to do good community history, there has to be some sort of shared agreements, if not a shared agenda, on what's being done and the goal. I think that one of the problems, as Rose said earlier, once an insider does their own community, they're no longer an insider. And there's also dangers because they're part of a certain element in the community in how they are seen. So they're automatically bringing in something of the outsider when they become involved even in doing their own community's history, unless it's a truly grassroots project in which none of us are ever called upon. And there are some projects like that, but for the most part, I don't think that there are those sorts of, quote, pure insider projects. Okay. And then I think we have to talk about sub-community projects because it's not a community history.
Thank you, Sherna. At this time, we want to go take a look at a segment from a video documentary that George Wright had a role in working with. It's a documentary that looked at a small community in Kentucky, Corbin, Kentucky, where there was a race riot, so to speak, or so described in history, in 1919. And Robbie Henson, a producer, and George Wright and some others went to Corbin a couple of years ago interviewing people about what happened in that community. And what makes it most interesting is that it's a community now that where maybe only 1 or 2 families of African Americans now live. And they found some interesting things in looking at this community, and we want to share some of that with you right now.
I heard bam, 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 bam. I thought, what? I asked Mr. Brooks, I said, what is that? What is that? He said, I don't know. He said, I heard something about this going to run the colored folks out of Corbin. I said, run them out for what?
We used to have American Legion posts here, and we used to put on some minstrel shows here. One night we had a show where Shorty Fowler, he was the fire chief. He was dressed up as a colored man, and Joe Surfer, he was a policeman. And he run into Shorty Fowler, and he told Shorty, he said, don't you know we don't have much use for colored folks around here? Shorty Fowler said, yeah, that's what I know. That's the reason I want to live here in Corbin, because the devil never would look for a nigger in Corbin.
One of the riots occurred in Corbin, Kentucky, about 60 miles from where I was born.
I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to Corbin, Kentucky, the home of the Kentucky Fried Chicken King, Colonel Harlan Sanders. We are located approximately 75 to 80 miles north of Knoxville, Tennessee. We consider this to be one of the finest communities to live in the Kentucky, state of Kentucky.
Corbin today, for its size, is about as sophisticated a town as you're going to find. I'm satisfied that Corbin, Kentucky will continue to progress, and I think that's the way it ought to be.
I noticed that Corbin, like other towns, has a Dixie Motel. They have a Dixie restaurant. They're not the only town that has those, but again, these are some of the things that stand out when you go through a city like Corbin. That it definitely is a small southern town. But unlike most small southern towns, it has no black people. It seems like you go through any other town as long as we've been here, and you would see at least some older blacks at the courthouse area or somewhere, but not in this town.
They have chosen to live in either Barberville, Williamsburg, or north of Corbin, which is toward London, Lilly, Kentucky, a little community of Lilly, those areas. But their reasons for that decision, I have no knowledge of that. I don't feel that there is any more prejudice in Corbin, Kentucky than you'll find in any other community in the country.
I had a dog growing up. Show you a picture of him. Black, white feet, white throat, little white tip on his tail. I loved that dog. That dog knew when I was going to service. He knew when I got in trouble. He knew when I was phoning home. He'd come up, lay on the porch, and look at the phone. And it'd ring. If it was from me, he'd bark like wild, make sure somebody answered the phone. You know what his name was? Nigger.
And that was your dog?
That's right. I loved that dog. That wasn't no bad name. That's because he was black, shiny, pretty, muscular. Come on, nigger. You see? I wasn't using it in a bad way. I have heard that story, I guess, 100 times since I've been in Corbin. And it's been told to me about 100 different ways, so I really don't know. I do know one thing for sure.
There was a racial incident in Corbin that happened some 70 years ago. I would not pretend to describe that incident to you or anybody else because I don't know. In fact, I never have been told that incident by anyone who was actually there and seen it happen. You know.
For some time now, I've been doing research on racial violence in Kentucky, and one of the things that most fascinates me is the whole concept of blacks being run out of various communities. This is the Lexington Herald, and so look at this. Right on the front page, the Lexington Herald, Saturday, November the 1st, 1919. Negroes driven from Corbin by mob of whites. And like newspapers quite often back then, they then will have several other headlines. Attack on railroad switchman Wednesday night given as cause of disturbance. And then they point out 500 pistol shots fired. The attacking mob of whites.
That article right there is a damn lie. So that son of a bitch trying to justify his damned expenses to come to Corbin. So he wrote up 500 shots fired and everything. I say you're wrong, and even including Corbin in your write-up, because you're going to harm Corbin and people are going to jump down your throat. Because blacks have not been discriminated against in this town.
The mob formed last night and searched the city for Negroes. The Negroes who felt the fury of the mob in the greatest degree were a gang of about 200 Negroes who had been working on the L&N grade for 10 months at South Corbin, where the railroad company is making big improvements. Crowds went to the restaurants and other public places, caught all Negro employees they could, and drove them singly or in gangs at the point of guns to the depot. Many Negroes were beaten and 200 were driven out of town. An extra coach was put on the L&N train number 31, and a carload of the Negroes were taken to Knoxville, about 90 miles south.
Certainly that's a provocative piece of videotape that uses oral history and historical documentation. We had a question called in from Western Kentucky University. What changes do you see occurring as a result of the increased use of videotape? And George, I want to turn to you. You've been across Kentucky doing audio interviews, and then you were involved in this video documentary project. How different was the process for you in terms of the kind of information you got and how you felt about it as a historian documenting history?
Okay. First of all, growing up in Kentucky in the 1950s and 1960s, I heard various accounts that there were cities that black people could not live in. And that clashed with my concept of American society, of American justice, and so on down the line. And in many ways, though one side of me said, well, I'm sure that's true, I really did not want to accept that completely. At some point when I became involved in the whole concept of race relations, I thought it was very important to just try and document this type of thing. And so one of the things we did right off is that we refused to buy into some of the really awful examples, really absurd examples about Corbin. See, some people even told me there were 10 blacks lynched that night. No one was lynched that night in Corbin. No one was killed. Some people were hurt, and so on down the line. So we tried to take a very fair analysis of that. We looked at a number of sources in addition to oral interviews. An interracial group called the Commission on Interracial Cooperation sent people there. There are papers in the NAACP records in Washington that I was able to look at. But clearly, talking to a wide range of people was very important. I went to Corbin along with Robbie Henson, and I must admit I felt a little bit uncomfortable being there given the fact that very few black people go to Corbin these days, and in fact, as far as we could tell, only one black family was there, though there were some whites who were sympathetic as well. And several people have mentioned the ethical component of what we do, and I thought it was very important for me not to portray the people who made certain comments that were very critical of of the white establishment in Corbin in such a way that they would come in for abuse. You see, I'm going to Corbin for a couple of days, and then I would go back to Lexington and then on back to Texas, and yet those people would still have to live there in that regard. But one of my final comments I'd like to make about all this is that even though we're talking about Corbin, and I know there are people there who were very offended and feel very offensive about the whole thing, we can show you that this happened in dozens of cities in Kentucky. There are examples throughout the South. There are examples of this throughout the North. So tragically, in a real sense, what we're talking about was a phenomenon that happened in American society, not just limited to Corbin, Kentucky. It would be good if we could say it was only Corbin, Kentucky that did this, but this was a phenomenon that black people faced in many parts, and not to mention Jewish people in some parts of the South as well.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Kathleen.
Oh, there's one point I wanted to raise about this film clip that we saw, which is that when you're looking at racism, I think in oral history sense, you have to be careful not to just get on videotape or on tape recorder people who are unsophisticated enough to say things that people who are maybe more sophisticated but equally or more benefit from racism and participate in racism wouldn't say. And I think that sometimes if we go around and try to document this, what we get are people who are, older, younger, whatever, have their guard let down, and what we don't capture are people who are really participating and benefiting from
That's a good
racism.
point. That is, Kathy. And we had a question called in for you. The questioner wants to know, have the women you have interviewed changed their attitudes about racism?
No, they have absolutely not changed their attitudes about racism since they had been in the Klan, and maybe even more disturbingly, despite anything I ever said and despite everything I did say to them during interviews, they refused to believe that I didn't share those racist attitudes. The fact that I was white just must meant that I was just putting on a show of not being a racist. They really saw that as the white person's belief.
We have a question from our studio audience. Go ahead.
My name is Vicki Hawes, and I'm chairperson of the Chicago Oral History Roundtable, which I'd like to welcome all the viewers and anybody else who hears of us to our programs. I'd like to, just in connection with that, give a phone number since we don't have one single place, and that is 708-681-3696. If anyone wants to call, we have 10 monthly impressive meetings scheduled this year, and I'd be happy to let you know. I had two questions. If I get one in, I guess I'll be lucky. And that is, much of the projects that have been discussed this afternoon have been affiliated with universities, and earlier funding was talked about that universities are able to apply for these things. And since the focus of the program is community histories, and presumably many of the people participating and watching today are in very grassroots community groups, I wondered if there's any suggestion for them to get funding for projects, or is the first line of offense to go get affiliation with your local university?
Years ago, when I started my work, when I was teaching at the University of Kentucky, though I was affiliated with that university, the state of Kentucky had the Kentucky Oral History organization that you could apply to for funds, and that was very helpful. And also in Lexington, and I would assume this is true in other places, there were something like the Lexington Urban League. There were in other words, there were parts of city or local government that I think were interested, as well as the state itself. And since that time, I have come across a number of churches, for instance, that are interested give an example in Kentucky, the General Association of Baptists, which was a black organization that's been interested in documenting their past. So there may be, for a number of reasons, some organizations that could be approached, and you explain to them how you're interested in that group's history, or be it contemporary or whatever, and they might in fact be interested in. So I think there are vehicles other than universities that would be interested in community oral history projects.
I started my work in a community project that several of us began, and I went into the university because I couldn't support that project in any other way. But I think that George is right. There are state agencies, but there are also groups, particularly if people in the group become involved. Very often, I think if you focus on public programming, it's considerably easier to get funding. For the most part, agencies don't want to just support archival projects or research, but they will be support for public programming, and oral history is a component of it, and then you produce the sort of program like many of the programs we've seen today.
Go ahead, you have another question?
My second question, and especially to George Wright, with some of your work, but if other people have input, I'm wondering if any of you've been involved in oral history projects that have been particularly geared to using oral history as a therapeutic process. It's just its existence, it's the process. It involves a lot of catharsis, but whether there's been structure to help people in dealing with problems, especially victims of violence.
Maybe some other can speak to that. I have not been personally in that regard. I thought earlier today when the comment was made about in New York, how I think through Hunter College they might have been involved in illiteracy or something like that. I could see how that is a beneficial aspect. And but again, I'm not so sure of what exactly people have done in those areas.
I want to follow up on some of the themes that were raised in the recent videotape we saw in terms of the Corbin race situation. And Kathy, I thought your comments were great in terms of bringing some of that to the forefront. But I want to push that a little bit in terms of talking about the ethical dilemmas, that we run into as oral historians. And I think the ethical dilemmas are highlighted in a community context because it becomes so personal and so close to you. Sherna, what would you add to that?
Well, one of the things that struck me, and it also goes back to partially to the question that the last person asked, and Kathy's early comment that we don't want to empower people's bad attitudes. But in effect, I view myself as an advocate scholar. I know some people think that's not possible. I think it is. And I think oral history provides a unique opportunity for us to do that. Is there a way that we can hold up the oral history as a mirror for the person to be able to at least reflect upon some of their attitudes and ideas? I don't believe that we're neutral. I think that in a way we almost fix people in their positions sometimes once they're on video saying these things. How do we then get people in Corbin to look at themselves? Perhaps to hear from some of the Afro-Americans from Corbin who were thrown out, if that's a way for them to somehow hold up a mirror to themselves, see the other side of the mirror. I think it's very problematic. But what do we do when we go to communities like that? Do we free some of these racist attitudes? Because once someone recounts something and it becomes memorialized, there are ways in which it, I think, becomes almost a permanent artifact, rather than figuring out a way to use that for change. I don't have the answer, but I think it's a very, very big problem when we look at certain sorts of issues, particularly.
Rina, from the audience?
This isn't a question, but more a response to the comment, your comment, Sherna, and to the question, which is that in some ways oral history can also be used as more than just a documentation or research. And I'm thinking of ways in which experimentally we could do oral histories with groups of people and actually have the people themselves participate in the interpretation process. Because we always reserve the interpretation, or we generally reserve the interpretation process for ourselves later on. And when you actually engage people who are giving testimony in the analysis of the testimony and the interpretation process, then I think there's a possibility of addressing questions that are very sensitive, developing thought around that, because also one of the issues in oral history is that you're plunked down and you're put a microphone in front of you and you say speak, and sometimes the reflective process there isn't that much room for that kind of self-reflection. So I think oral history provides an interesting vehicle also for engaging in that kind of self-interpretation.
Thank you, Rina. Well, unfortunately, we've almost run out of time, and the time has really flown by, and I want to thank you, Kathy, for joining us, and we're looking forward here in Cleveland to hearing more about your work tomorrow at the luncheon, and I would suggest to the people at the sites around the country that if they want to find out more about your work, to purchase your book, Women in the Klan, and if they don't want to purchase it themselves, make sure their library has it. It's an excellent book, and Sherna, I want to thank you for being here today and sharing your thoughts, and also, if people want to learn more about your work, Women's Words, which is a wonderful book about the feminist practice of oral history, if people can ask their librarians to order that or get their own copies, I think they'll benefit a lot from learning more about oral history. And George, thank you a lot. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts tonight. And of course, I'll put in a plug for your book too, Racial Violence in Kentucky. I want to thank everyone at the sites who joined us today and participated. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties, but I'm glad we were able to get your questions in. I want to thank the studio audience who was here with us today and participating, came over in a rainstorm to be with us, and I appreciate you doing that. I want to thank again our sponsors, Cuyahoga Community College, which has just supported us over the last year and a half tremendously in putting this together and making it possible. Baylor University, Tom Charlton and his colleagues at Baylor have been tremendous in support. I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Kentucky and also, again, the Marantz Corporation, and remind you that this purchasing program between the Oral History Association and Marantz will be available in our publications very, very soon. I want to also say that a videotaped copy of this program will be available for purchase, and for more information about that, you can write to Media Design and Production at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, and I think you're going to see that address on the screen right now. And so if you'll write to that address, we can give you information about purchasing a copy of this program. We're sorry that you couldn't be with us here in Cleveland. We're going to go back to the Stouffer Tower City Hotel for 3 more days of discussion on this kinds of topics. But I'd like to invite you to join us next year in Birmingham, Alabama, November 4th through the 7th, 1993. The Oral History Association will have its annual meeting in Birmingham. In 1994, Rose Diaz, who you met today at the University of New Mexico, will be our host for the National Oral History Conference, and we're already looking forward to that. In 1995, we'll be in Milwaukee. So we move our program and our conference around the country so that those of you in different parts of the country have an opportunity to join us. Tom Charlton, who told you about the Community Oral History pamphlet, wanted us to mention that the pamphlet costs $7.50. And you can get that by writing to the Oral History Association at its headquarters in Los Angeles, California. The address is on the screen right now. And also, for further information about the Oral History Association or to join us and become a member of the Oral History Association, you can write to that address. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye.